Hello again, everybody. Today, I'll be giving another presentation. This time, it'll be on Japan, and I'll be talking about the samurai and their various religions and stuff like that. So, I hope you guys enjoy it. Okay, so to begin, here's my cover page, Japan. Okay. So some just basic facts about Japan. It's part of Eastern Asia, and it's an island chain between the North Pacific Ocean and the Sea of Japan. So as you can see with this map here, it's just kind of this like island chain that goes across. And the climate ranges from tropical AC in the south to cold D in the north, which is it's kind of interesting that it's actually tropical on one part of it, but it gets really snowy and cold up near Sapporo. That area especially gets pretty cold, and the terrain is mostly mountainous. An interesting thing about Japan, as you can see, Mount Fuji, there's all these volcanoes in the center right here, and so Tokyo is all on the coast and everything with all the towns due to the fact that the volcanoes are all over the island. So more than 70% of Japan consists of mountains, and including more than 200 volcanoes out of all these mountains. So the biggest natural hazard obviously are earthquakes and the volcanic activity, because Japan is over a fault line, and as just shown, the capital of Japan is Tokyo. So these are just some interesting facts about Japan that I found. Japan is slightly smaller than California, so this map right here kind of shows, you can see California right there, and then there's Japan. So Japan actually kind of looks bigger there, but according to what I read, it's actually slightly smaller. The primary religions are Shinto and Buddhism. Shinto kind of just believes in, nature is God, and you kind of just live by nature. And Buddhism is more of a passive aggressive religion. They believe in pacifism. And another interesting thing is sumo is Japan's national sport, and baseball is also very popular there. But sumo is kind of like, you can think of the NFL in the United States. That's kind of how sumo is over in Japan. And in Japan, it is not uncommon to eat rice at every meal, including breakfast. So yeah, they really like their rice. So here's just some early history of Japan. The first humans arriving around 3500 BC, they believed to be immigrants of China and Korea. And Japanese myth holds that Emperor Jimmu was the first emperor of an imperial line that is still in place today. And the first historical documents mentioning Japan date around the 5th century. This is just an old Japanese Civil War painting that I found. Pretty cool. So the history continued. Nara was the first centralized capital of the nation, and it was established in the late 8th century. And this was influenced by the Chang'an of China at the time, which was the big the big city state in China, influenced a lot of Japan, how they built and everything, and how they set up their society. And after a succession of powerful shogun, Japan was in a civil war for most of the 15th century. And Japan had been fairly secluded from outside countries for most of its history up to this point. So it kind of just looked at what China was doing, and it just kind of mimicked that. And this is actually a daikuden at Heijo Palace. This just kind of shows you the architecture they went for, which very Chinese. So now we get to the opening of Japan's borders. In 1543, it is believed that the first Europeans to visit Japan arrived via a Chinese ship, and they were selling guns. And learning of this event, it opened up Japan's borders to the west, creating international trade. So kind of just was like a two-way thing from there, China and the West. So Christian missionaries also arrived, and many of the Japanese lower class accepted and began to follow this religion. This kind of went against Japan's strict Shinto and Buddhism. So the shogun which were like they were like the government of this time. They did not agree with this, and they even went as far as killing some of the Christians to make examples of them, and foreign merchants in an attempt to reclose Japan's borders. And this is just an image of Chinese ships sailing to Japan. So, to understand this shogun thing, here's just a little slide about the Japan feudalism, kind of giving you the hierarchy of how Japan was. So, you had the shogun, he was like the king, pretty much. Think of like England, England had kings. And he ruled the country through the daimyo, and they were like the nobles, who were the heads of the samurai, and the samurai were like the military. You think of like our Marines nowadays, that's kind of how the samurai would have been considered back then. And then you had the peasants who farmed the land, and they did this primarily in exchange for protection from the samurai. And the shogun was also sort of a military commander or a general, so even though he was a king, he was also very well respected on the battlefield, and he would often go into battle with his fellow warriors. And the social mobility was extremely rigid. There was just no way to move above or below one station. So basically, like you'd be pretty much proud of what you were. That was something that I thought was cool about Japanese culture. It was like they picked something that they enjoyed or that they were good at, and they just became experts at it. They woke up every day and they just practiced that until they became professionals. So this image right here just shows the hierarchy. As I just mentioned, you got the emperor, the shogun, the daimyos, the samurai, the peasants, and the artisans and the merchants. And interestingly enough, actually, merchants were considered, they're the lowest class because they were actually considered parasitic to Japanese society. Like, they felt like the merchants were just coming in and kind of like selling stuff without actually earning the right to sell it. So I thought that was interesting. Merchants were very lowly regarded. And daimyos were kind of just like, as I said, they were nobles, but they were kind of like the landowners. They were kind of like the real estate type people. So, yeah. So now we get into the samurai, which to me, this is one of the most fascinating things about ancient Japan, because the samurai, other than like the Spartans, were like some of the most cool warriors you'll ever read about. So here's just some little things about them. The samurai were essentially the military warriors of feudal Japan, and an interesting word, or an interesting thing about the word samurai, is it actually means to serve. So they believe they're in service to the emperor. The samurai followed a code of chivalry called Bushido, which means way of the warrior, and Bushido is another way of looking at just living an honorable life. I mean, it was a way of living, and they believed that if they had to, then they would give their life for their cause, and they didn't really fear death. They kind of went into battle just basically expecting it to happen and almost like welcoming it. So as this says, this philosophy taught its warriors to not fear death, but to welcome it. This made the samurai some of the most elite warriors the world has ever seen, because they fought with such ferocity. And if a samurai could not bear the shame of a defeat, he would perform seppuku, which basically means stomach cutting on himself. And this was a ritualistic thing that they did, a form of suicide where they would disembowel themselves to regain their lost honor. And so, yeah, samurai, really cool. I recommend doing some reading on them if you're interested, because they're awesome to learn about. So now to just get back to Japan. So this is the isolation period, and basically this goes along with what I talked about before with the Christian missionaries showing up and the shogun not liking it. So finally in 1603, after decades of civil war, the Tokugawa shogunate was established by the Tokugawa clan. And in 1633 to 39, Sakoku, which means locked country, was established. So this allow foreigners to enter Japan, nor allow any Japanese to leave the country under penalty of death. Okay, so this was serious business for Japan. And during the more than 200 years that this policy was in place, Japan's native culture thrived. However, their technological prowess diminished. So, just to elaborate on that, their culture thrived because they had no outside influences. They were able to just be content with themselves, but their technological prowess diminished because, meanwhile, in other parts of the world where trade was still established, people were sharing ideas and they were advancing in that way, where Japan was kind of stuck in the old ways still. They just since they closed the border for 200 years, that's a long time, so it's like you're not going to advance much technologically wise. However, they were not completely isolated. Japan still did trade with the Dutch and the Chinese because obviously living on that tiny island chain, like they're gonna need a way to get supplies other than that. So this is just an image of the Tokugawa family crest, which I thought was pretty cool. So we go through 200 years of this, and now we enter the modernization period. And if any of you have seen the film The Last Samurai, this is kind of where that movie will start, when Japan is looking for more Western influences like the U.S. So this is just how this started. In 1853, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry visited Japan in 4 steam-powered ships in what is now present-day Tokyo Harbor. And the Japanese saw this and they were just absolutely mesmerized by it. They thought they had seen the future. They're just like, what is this? This is like, not even the future. It was like some sort of alien invasion to them. It was so spectacular. And they nicknamed it the Black Ships because of all the modern weapons that were on there, like cannons and Gatling guns, stuff like that. The Treaty of Kanagawa was signed in 1954, and this allowed trade between the U.S. and Japan, so this officially ended the isolation period of Japan. And in 1868, Emperor Meiji began a period of reformation to Japan's policy. This period was called the Meiji Restoration. This was again just put into place to bring Japan back into the fold, unisolate it, allow its borders to be opened. And under this new rule, the emperor decided Japan needed to become more civilized and Western. That is the key. They were looking at the West after they saw these ships, and they just said, we need to be doing this because we are not advanced at all, and these guys could just crush us. So this is just an image right here of Commodore Matthew Perry. This was the guy that visited. So now we have Japan's rise in power. This is a quick overview. So in 1890, Japan was the most powerful military force in Asia because, like I said before, the Japanese, they're tenacious in their pursuits for greatness in anything they do. So as soon as they started to become westernized and the samurai started to die off and they started to use guns and stuff like that, just more modern tactics, their dedication allowed them to rise very rapidly, and they became a regional power. They were able to defeat both China and Russia, and they occupied Korea for a time. And in 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, and now we start leading into the events of World War II, obviously. They allied with Nazi Germany and Hitler, and on December 7th, 1941, the infamous day, Japan attacks the U.S. at Pearl Harbor. And that's another discussion all in and of itself, but basically after Japan's defeat in World War II, they became an ally to the U.S., and they are now an economic power, and we still are allied with them to this day. We share trades with them. So now that leads into Japan today. Japan has changed from a militaristic rule to a democracy, so they're more like the U.S. now. As of 2009, Japan has the second largest economy, rivaled only by the U.S. So yeah, they produce a lot of electronics. A lot of cars come from there. Produce some of the biggest car brands available, including Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and etc. Massive producer of consumer electronics, so Nintendo, Sony, Toshiba, Sharp, and Panasonic. These are all famous Japanese products. One of the leading nations in scientific research, particularly technology, as I just said, and they are massively urbanized nation, around 90% urbanized population. And the big reason for this, as I'd mentioned in the beginning, is because Japan is a volcanic island chain, so all of the cities have to be built along the coastline. This basically means that everything is very crammed. Like, as this picture shows, this is Tokyo, Japan today. Everything is very crammed and just very claustrophobic because they have to put everything on the coast, and it's just massive. So pretty crazy. So that is my presentation, guys. I hope you have enjoyed this. And these are my sources cited. Sorry it's late, but yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this.